Welcome to your lecture on tissues. Well, not these kinds of tissues, right? Of course, these kinds of tissues. The tissues that make up you and the tissues that make up me. And these tissues are very diverse, and we're going to spend this lecture trying to break down all the different kinds of tissues that make up the human body. Now, this lecture is going to be kind of long because there's a lot of them, so no prob, right? Because this is an online lecture. That means you can pause it and rewind it and play it and pause it and rewind it and play it as much as you want. So pace yourself, spread it out, right? Well, turns out there's lots of different kinds of tissues. So let's take a look at the nature of these tissues. Well, first of all, our body has a lot of cells, right? With the exception of some other materials, we're mostly cells. And in fact, there's about 75 trillion cells making you up. 75 trillion. Just put that in perspective of the national debt. Anyway, we can take all these cells and say, okay, how do these cells work together to make an organism function? And it turns out that if you have a group of cells, they might be diverse cells, and they're all working together for a common function, we call that a tissue. Not this kind of tissue, the tissues that make up our body. Now, they're very diverse, and we can organize them into basically 4 categories. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so again, a tissue is a group of cells performing similar functions. There's outside material called an extracellular matrix. So let's see what we got here. We have muscle tissue. You know, most muscles that you think about, you know, like your biceps or your triceps or your quadriceps, those are muscles you can work out at the gym. Those are skeletal muscles. They're under your conscious, voluntary control. But you also have muscle tissue in the body that is not under voluntary control. So, for example, you have what's called smooth muscle. And that smooth muscle is lining your blood vessels. It's in your intestine. These are things that help natural processes to occur in the body, but they do it automatically. It's like autopilot. You're not consciously thinking about it. And you have cardiac muscle, which, you know, makes up your heart. So we'll talk more about these different kinds of muscle tissues. And of course, later in the semester, we're going to go hardcore into muscle, and you'll be learning all the parts of at the cellular level of muscles. And of course, you'll be learning all the muscles. Stay tuned for that. That's always fun. Well, let's see what other kinds of things you have here. You have nervous tissue. So if I can get my little pointer here. Nervous tissue is obviously tissue associated with the nervous system. So let's come over here. So we just talked about muscle tissue. So that's one of the 4 types. But then we have nervous tissue. And so obviously you have nervous tissue in your brain. You have nervous tissue running throughout your body that contains your nerve cells. And, you know, especially in the later parts of anatomy physiology, you get into all the nitty-gritties of the cells that make up nervous tissue. The first topic we're going to talk today is about epithelial tissue, and it's one of my favorites because it's so much fun to look at under a microscope. And if you take anatomy and physiology lab, you will spend a lot of time looking at epithelial tissue under a microscope. So that will be what we tackle first. So of course, keeping with our little schematic here, let's circle our epithelial tissue. And we have connective tissue. And so here's a picture of one type of connective tissue, but with all of these categories, particularly with the connective tissue and the epithelial tissue, you're going to find that these are very broad categories. Because I know you're sitting there like, 4 types of tissue, connective tissue, epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue. I can dig that. I can memorize that. Well, turns out there's a lot of subcategories in each of those, especially epithelial tissue and connective tissue. So we're going to try to break those down and learn the different subcategories and in some cases subcategories and try to keep it all straight in our head. But the real challenge is once you've learned this stuff, not just knowing these categories, but being able to understand what kind of tissue you'll find in different parts of the body. So for example, in your trachea, what kind of epithelial tissue lines your trachea, your windpipe? And it turns out, just like anything in A&P, form follows function, or function follows form, in the sense that the form will dictate what kind of functions can come out of that. but the function, the need for that particular structure will help guide the evolution of that structure over time. So anyway, we're going to be looking at both the structure and the function of some of these tissues. So let's get started. So let's start off with epithelial tissue. And I have over here some different pictures of epithelial tissue. And my goal is by the end of this talk on epithelial tissue, you'll be able to pick a slide. Maybe you go to Google Images and you Google epithelial tissue and it'll show you a bunch of different pictures. You should be able to tell me what kind of epithelial cells are making up that tissue. And it's actually really fun. It's like a game. So epithelial tissue. Well, let's take a look at some of the root words here. So let's look at this beginning of this word, epi. Now you'll see the prefix epi a lot in anatomy and physiology. If you've studied the body regions, for example, you might recall the epigastric region, which means upon the belly region. So if you learn these prefixes and in some cases suffixes early on, it will really help you as you go through your anatomy and physiology studies, because you'll be able to be like, oh yeah, I remember that means upon, or that means to the side, or that means below, and it'll just make it that much easier to learn these things. So epithelial tissue is tissue that lies upon another kind of tissue. And this kind of tissue lines every body surface and all body cavities. So this is really interesting, actually. So if you think of all of your blood vessels, they're lined on the inside and on the outside of the tubes with epithelial cells. So one way you could think of epithelial tissue is that it's always facing some kind of space. So if you draw like a little tube here, I'm going to draw a little tube down here, and okay, I'm really horrible at drawing, especially with an electronic pen, but you get the idea. So imagine this is a tube. It's a blood vessel, or it's a digestive tract, or it's your trachea. It's some kind of tube. There's always a space inside that tube, and then outside of that tube is also some kind of space. Maybe it has fluid in it, but it's open to some other part of the body. Now that space that goes inside of a tube is called the lumen. So anytime you hear the word lumen, it means space. And so why would we want a bunch of epithelial tissue lining the inside of our tubes and the outside of our tubes? Well, it has to do with the function of the epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue has a lot of functions, very, very important functions. But let's take a look at this slide right here, this little picture. We're going to learn in just a little bit the kind of epithelial tissue that we're looking at, but right away you know that you're looking at a cross-section of a tube because we have a lumen. So I am actually going to change my pen color for this just to make it a little bit easier here. Boop. Okay, and I'm going to write in this space lumen. Okay, so that's my lumen. And then of course outside of this tube, so you can see that the edge of the tube there looks like it's packed with other cells, but nonetheless it's kind of a space. It's some other thing going on. And so all these cells packed in here are epithelial cells, and together they form epithelial tissue. And over here, these are epithelial cells. Let's change colors again. And so here's one epithelial cell. Here's another epithelial cell, and notice that each one has a nucleus. So these are epithelial cells here, and then up here we have yet another micrograph, and this is a different kind of epithelial tissue layer, and each of these cells is actually kind of long, and they're all packed tightly together. So this is characteristics of epithelial tissue. These cells are jam-packed in together. So it's kind of like if you had chess pieces. So these are pawns if you've ever played chess. These guys are all lined up really close together. They're kind of forming a barrier, right? They're like little soldiers lined up. They're very cool, and as you can see just from these pictures, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, but they all serve very, very important functions for the body. So let's take a look at some of these functions. Number one, epithelial tissue can play a function in protection. Very, very important, right? Because our bodies are constantly under attack. I mean, it's like a war zone there. We have pathogens trying to get in. We have chemicals from the environment, toxins trying to get in our body. And of course, our skin, which we'll be learning more about the skin very soon, it is lined with an epithelium as well. It's lined with epithelial tissue. And all that is on the outside, it's these layers of cells, these kind of soldiers lined up. And so because these cells are so tightly packed together, they're forming a barrier. They're kind of like locking arms. And that's going to allow only the things we want inside of our cells. So water, for example, or nutrients. Like if you're talking about the epithelial layer of your intestine, you want to be able to absorb nutrients into there. But if you're talking about bacteria, you don't want those in. So these guys actually can protect us and help to determine what can go in and what can't go in. And so that property of determining, taking in the good stuff and keeping out the bad stuff, we can call that selective permeability. That means that it's selective in what can permeate, penetrate through that epithelial cell layer and into the lumen or into your body. So epithelial tissue, it serves for protection. It allows good things in and bad things to stay out. And in some cases, and most cases, epithelial tissue can have secretions. So what that means is the individual cells making up the epithelial tissue actually can produce something. So let's take an example. Let's draw a typical epithelial cell here. And as you'll learn in a minute, they come in different shapes and sizes, but I'm going to do a nice simple one. Let's say this guy looks like a cube. And they actually, in many cases, have some kind of little projections at one end. And of course, let's draw the nucleus. You can't forget the nucleus. So these guys will be kind of your first line of defense. And maybe we're looking at the inside of an intestine. So there might be another set of epithelial cells facing on the other side, the space in the middle. Well, in the case of, let's say that we're talking about the cells inside the intestine, the epithelial cells, this guy will actually produce something called mucin. Now, that does not look like a U, does it? Mucin. Mucin, when combined with water, makes mucus. And so these little mucin particles that are being produced will make their way out of the cell and into the lumen. And when you get all these cells doing that at the same time, they're serving a common purpose, you get this nice layer of mucus lining your intestines. Smooth move, right? You want that to happen because that helps all the stuff that you're digesting to make its way through there. So anyway, physical protection, selective permeability, and secretions. Ooh, and then we got epithelial cells that have sensations. So think of your skin. If I start going like this, I get all goosebumpy, right? So you actually have the ability for these epithelial tissues to kind of register what's going on in the environment. They actually have sensation. They're tied into the nervous system, and therefore they can sort of determine, is this a good feeling? Is this a bad feeling? If my epithelial cells hit a hot stove, that doesn't feel so good. Let's take an overview of that.
Epithelia form the surface layer of the body, line body cavities, hollow organs, and structures, and constitute most gland tissue. Any substance that enters or leaves the body must cross an epithelium. All epithelia consist of one or more layers of tightly packed cells and little or no extracellular matrix between cells. Distinguishing features of an epithelium include a free apical surface and a fixed basal surface. Specialized intercellular junctions join adjacent cells, and a thin basement membrane separates the basal surface from underlying connective tissue layers. Although epithelia lack blood vessels, many sensory nerve endings are present. Epithelia have a high regenerative capacity that allows them to maintain their function. The primary functions of an epithelium are to resist dehydration and injury from physical, chemical, and biological agents, to selectively regulate materials entering and leaving the body, to secrete products produced by epithelial glands, and to monitor the environment through specialized sensory nerve endings and specialized epithelial cells. Epithelial tissues are classified using two basic criteria: the number of cell layers and the shape of the cell at the apical surface. An epithelium composed of one layer of cells is termed simple. If there are two or more layers of cells, the epithelium is termed stratified. When the apical cells are flat and thin, the epithelium is classified as squamous. Apical cells that are somewhat square shape belong to a cuboidal classification, while those with a rectangular shape are termed columnar. By combining the criteria of cell shape and number of layers, all epithelia can be classified easily. For example, a simple squamous epithelium is composed of a single layer of thin, flat cells. In contrast, a stratified squamous epithelium is composed of multiple layers of cells, with the apical surface layer being thin and flat. These same tenets could be applied to cuboidal and columnar epithelia. There are two special types of epithelia. Transitional epithelium, found in the urinary tract, is a stratified epithelium that gives the impression of transitioning from cuboidal, when the epithelium is relaxed, to squamous, when it is stretched. A pseudostratified epithelium, found in the trachea, for example, is a simple epithelium in which all cells contact the basal lamina, but only some reach the apical surface. Cells are of varying heights, and their nuclei are at different positions in the epithelium, giving the impression of stratification. Some epithelial classes have specializations of the free surface of apical cells. Simple columnar epithelial cells in some organs have cilia, which are small, finger-like motile projections. Thus, simple columnar epithelium is subclassified as ciliated or non-ciliated. In parts of the digestive and urinary tracts, epithelial cells involved in absorption have a dense collection of short cytoplasmic processes called microvilli on their free surface. Microvilli are non-motile and serve to increase surface area. Because the microvilli appear fuzzy in the light microscope, cells with numerous microvilli are said to have a brush border. A stratified squamous epithelium has either dead or living cells as the surface layer. The dead cells contain the protein keratin. Therefore, stratified squamous epithelium is subclassified as keratinized or non-keratinized. Epithelial cells are tightly connected to adjacent cells by specializations called intercellular junctions. There are four types of junctions: tight junctions, adhering junctions, desmosomes, and gap junctions. Tight junctions, also known as zonula occludens, are bands of fused cell membrane near the free surface of adjacent epithelial cells. These junctions attach a cell to its neighbors, encircling cells and sealing the space between them. Thus, substances crossing the epithelium must pass through epithelial cells, not between them. Tight junctions are essential to the primary function of an epithelium, which is to regulate substances that enter and leave the body. Adhering junctions, also known as zonula adherens, have a similar band-like arrangement seen in tight junctions. They are located deep to the tight junctions and have numerous microfilament proteins from the cytoplasm that act as anchors for adjacent cells. There is a small gap between the cell membranes of adjacent cells at adhering junctions. Desmosomes, also known as macula adherens, are small button or snap-like junctions. These form at the points of mechanical stress. They are different from tight and adhering junctions in that they do not encircle the entire cell. Gap junctions are points where small pores connect the cytoplasm of adjacent cells. The gap junction consists of a series of hollow bridging structures called connexons. Small solutes, such as ions, glucose, and amino acids, pass through connexons from the cytoplasm of one cell into a neighboring cell.
Okay, so let's recap what was gone over in the video about the different categories and types of epithelial tissue layers. And I've given you yet another bunch of pretty pictures to ponder here. But you'll remember that there's kind of two main categories. You have the how many layers of cells you're dealing with. So let's actually write that down. Number of layers, that determines one type. Layers. And the other category is the shape. So talking about the layers specifically, you can basically break this down into two types. We have simple epithelium and we have stratified epithelium. So let's start with simple epithelium. Simple epithelium is very simple. It consists of just one layer of cells. So for example, you see here, this is a simple layer of epithelial cells. They're all just lined up. There's just one layer, all lined up and touching the basal membrane. And then here's your apical surfaces over here. Here is a picture of cells that are also in a simple layer structure, just one cell layer thick. So for example, the cheek cells, the epithelial cells lining your inside your cheek are one layer thick. So they are simple in that sense. Now, the opposite of simple is stratified, and this would be two or more layers of epithelial cells kind of stacked on top of each other. So if we look at this picture right here, notice that there's a layer here, and then there's a layer here, and a layer here, etc. So there's multiple layers of those cells, and that makes them what we call stratified. So simple epithelium tends to be found in areas where there's a necessity for transport. So for example, the lining of blood vessels, you got to transport blood, or areas that have saliva, things like that. So you tend to have transport functions for simple epithelium, whereas stratified are found in areas where protection is a major thing that you got to worry about. So for example, your palms and the soles of your feet, you want that to be nice, thick epithelial tissue because there's a lot of stress, you got a lot of ickies in the environment you got to worry about, and so you have stratified epithelium. Okay, so that's the number of tissue layers, so simple versus stratified. And then, and here's a third category I almost forgot to mention, yet how could we forget this? Pseudo-stratified. And of course you know that pseudo means, it means quasi, right? So pseudo-stratified, it's called pseudo-stratified because it's actually simple. It's one cell layer thick. But under a microscope, it kind of looks like there's multiple layers, but there's actually not. So if you can see this picture right here, and I hope my face isn't covering it, this is an epithelial layer turned on its side, and right along here is the basement membrane. Over here is the apical surface, and you'll notice that this is ciliated because there's all these little cilia here. So this is probably from the trachea. And notice that even though the nuclei of these cells, like this cell, the nucleus is up here, there it's down there, etc., makes it look like it's stratified, right? It kind of looks like something like this. But if you actually look really closely under a scope, you'll notice that the basal side, the basolateral side of these cells all touch that basement membrane. So even though the nuclei are positioned in weird places and not all of the cells touch the apical surface, they all do touch the basement membrane, the basal surface, and therefore they're simple, but they look like they're stratified, therefore we call it pseudo-stratified. So that kind of tissue is common in the respiratory system, the trachea. Now let's go to that second category, and that second category is shapes. So epithelial cells come in different shapes, and here they are. We got squamous, or squamous if you prefer, cuboidal, and columnar. Now, squamous, think of the word squash, right? If you squash something, you make it flatter. So squamous cells are flattened cells. So when you look at them from the side, they're going to look something like this. Now, when you look at them from the top, you know, let's say you did a cross section, then they're going to just look like something like this. So if you look at this diagram, it's actually good at kind of illustrating what I'm talking about. So a sagittal section or a longitudinal section, imagine these are your cheek cells, because those are simple squamous. Cross section makes it look flat like that, but a longitudinal section, you're basically just getting it flat like that, like it's been squashed. Okay, so that's one type. Flat cells are squamous cells. Cube-shaped cells, so I'm just going to draw it kind of something like this, and sometimes it's not perfect cube, but cube-shaped cells like you see here, these are, and I know that my head's in the way for that one, so I will do this one. So these cube-shaped cells are called cuboidal, and cells that kind of have more of a column shape are columnar. Makes sense, right? Squamous, flat, cuboidal, cube, columnar are tall cells. Now, there's also a kind of cell that's often stuck in between these columnar cells, and these are called goblet cells. And these are cells that specifically produce mucin, which becomes mucus. So take a look at this one up here. So each of these little cells, this is a columnar epithelial layer. That's one columnar cell, and right here is a special type of columnar cell called a goblet cell. So I'm going to go ahead and label that as goblet cell. Okay, so squamous, cuboidal, columnar. So when you're actually describing epithelial tissue, you need both of those categories. How many layers is it, and what shape is it? And so we have simple squamous, like the lining inside your cheeks. We have simple cuboidal, like you see these cells lining a particular vessel here. So don't forget the inside space is the lumen, and then here's the outside. This is a cross section. And columnar cells, like you find in the intestine. Okay, so this would be an intestinal, simple columnar epithelium. And there's one more type that we need to talk about that kind of doesn't fit any of those things, and this is called transitional epithelium. So you saw this in the video. Transitional epithelium is found in the urinary tract, like your bladder, places where you need to stretch. So your bladder, as we all know, when it fills up with fluid, with urine, it stretches. And so the cells that make up the epithelial lining inside and outside of that bladder themselves stretch. And so you go from something that when your bladder's empty, the epithelial layer seems to be cuboidal in nature, right? Something like that. But when your bladder's full, it's stretched out, and so it turns into a layer of simple squamous epithelium. How cool is that? Okay. All right, so here, almost done talking about epithelial tissue, and then we'll talk about connective tissue in the next little video. So now recall that epithelial tissue lines spaces. So it lines the lumen, or it lines the space outside of the tissue that you're talking about, the structure outside of the blood vessel, for example. Now, that epithelial tissue layer in some cases actually kind of folds in on itself to produce a gland. Now, you've heard of glands before. You're like, okay, I'm sick, fill my glands. Well, in actuality, a true gland has a particular function. And remember that we talked about epithelial cells. You know, I drew one that looks like this. And we said epithelial cells serve a number of functions, including secretory functions. Secretory, that says secretory. Secretory functions, meaning it can produce products such as mucin, and that mucin can go outside of the cell. So it secretes a particular substance. So glands have a secretory function. But, you know, we've been talking a lot about mucin because I just think it's such a cool substance, actually, for things that have to happen in our body. And you can see goblet cells, which are just amazing. But mucin is only one kind of secretion that gland cells can produce. They also produce hormones. You're like, hormones, testosterone, estrogen, there are so many hormones in your body, and it could be argued that a personality is really a product of your hormones. You have a bad day, you're stressed, well, your stress hormones are up, etc. Well, hormones are secreted by glands. Other proteins called enzymes are secreted by glands, and we already know that waste products are secreted by glands. So we have here a picture. I'm going to outline the outside of it. This is a picture of a gland. And so notice, you got your epithelial layer here. We see the epithelial layer, and you'll be able to identify, especially if you zoom in, you'll be able to identify what kind of epithelial layer here is. And this is our lumen. So this is a gland, and glands can be embedded into your skin, but some glands actually are big, and they're kind of like organs. Like your pancreas could be considered a gland or have glands in it because it produces hormones. Now, there's two categories for these kinds of glands, depending on how they do their secretions. So the first type is called an endocrine gland. Endocrine gland, and you know that the prefix endo means inside. Endo, inside. Versus the other kind is called an exocrine gland, and you know that the prefix exo means on the outside. So this kind of gives you a clue of how we categorize these glands. Endocrine glands are glands that are going to secrete their secretions inside of the body or inside of that particular area, and exocrine glands secrete their secretions, in most cases, outside of the body. So here is another way you can kind of tell these guys apart. Endocrine glands have no ducts. So for example, you have epithelial layers inside of, just say for example, the testicles, and those are going to secrete testosterone. Now, testosterone is a hormone, and it's secreted directly into the bloodstream. And so because it's secreting the hormone directly into the bloodstream, it's an endocrine gland. Or think of your pituitary gland in your brain, and it, as you'll learn later, does so many functions, produces so many different kinds of hormones, and boom, put out in the bloodstream. Therefore, it's an endocrine gland because it's being secreted inside of the body. And so it doesn't need any ducts to do that. It doesn't need any little pathways. So if you look at this picture right here, if you can see this, what we have here is the opposite of an endocrine gland. This is an exocrine gland because it has a duct. See how, like, here's the gland, here's the epithelial layer, and just see how that's a little duct. So all the secretions travel through this duct and outside of the body. Whereas if you take an endocrine gland, like here, for example, here's actually an endocrine gland. These cells are going to produce their secretion that then goes directly into the bloodstream and circulate through the body. So there's no duct. There's no duct here. So nothing coming out of the cell, out of the tissue or out of the body. So endocrine glands, they have no ducts. Instead, they secrete directly into the blood or into the fluid that's not blood. It's kind of floating between the cells. You'll hear this term a lot. We call this interstitial fluid. Say that with me. Interstitial fluid is the fluid, it's usually watery, that surrounds cells, tissues. Now, exocrine glands do possess ducts. So that's this guy right here, right? So exocrine glands secrete their secretions outside of the body. So your sweat glands, the sebaceous glands, like the oil glands, secrete oil on your scalp. You haven't washed your hair for a couple days and it gets all gritty. Well, that's because that icky oil is kind of going through the ducts and outside onto your scalp. What else? Actually the pancreas can have an exocrine function. It's considered its digestive hormones that it's producing actually transfer to the digestive system, so it's going outside of that local region, and so that's considered an exocrine gland. Lacrimal glands. Lacrimal, as you'll learn later when we study bones, you have a lacrimal bone on either side of your tear ducts here. Lacrimal, it means tears in Latin, and so where do your tears come from? Well, you actually have cells in lacrimal glands that will secrete tears, and those are exocrine. They have ducts, your tear ducts, and then the tears come pouring out because you've had a bad day, hopefully not from, after an A&P test. So sebaceous is going to secrete oily substances. Sweat glands obviously secrete sweat. That does not look like it says oil. And lacrimal glands secrete tears. Another one, milk glands. Yeah, so breast tissue has milk glands, and if you're a lactating woman, you are able to have your epithelial cells surrounding your milk glands will produce milk. And it's exocrine because that milk will travel through your milk ducts and outside of the body to the baby. Okay, so enough about glands. That will conclude this first part of the lecture, and then we will go on to connective tissue in the next segment. Thanks for joining.